Now, if you've completed the evaluation, you should be starting here. What I have up on screen right now is a sample study template, and this isn't filled in by a real student, but it's filled in a way that I think is going to describe a common situation for a lot of you going through this process yourself. Now, the key mentality at this stage, now that you've evaluated a lot of different areas of your game and thought about perhaps some new concepts in a lot more detail than you've thought about them before, we want to, before diving into study, before feeling that obligation to get started, prioritize what needs to come first and set realistic goals that we can move through gradually rather than trying to address everything all at once. So it's going to be really important. I don't want you to skip this step after you've done the evaluation of trimming down to only a few fundamental things and giving your full focus to those few fundamental things in your study plan. So in this template, I've zoomed in on the evaluation notes first. This is, and I'll just kind of read through it as we go. This is free form for you to jot down your initial reaction, your overall thoughts on what seems to be most urgent or most important to you, having gone through the process of evaluating everything. So in this example, the student notices that there are pre-flop situations, fundamental situations where the ranges are unclear. And going through post-flop, there's this general sense of confidence, playing in position, but playing out of position, they're not quite as confident. Specifically, they call out their play from the big blind. They say that their play from the big blind could be improved because their win rate is poor from this position. This is obviously a good reason to focus on the big blind area, although a lot of times I do encourage my students to look beyond their win rates in different situations because that can be a little misleading. It's hard to benchmark a win rate. It's substantially easier to benchmark a stat that shows up in GTO or a win percentage. So in the database review section, I do talk about my preferred stats for tracking progress and for setting goals. But still, this is, I think, a good place to get started. We've identified that out of position is an area of concern, that the big blind is the most common out of position area of concern, and that pre-flop ranges are unclear, which is great. This is, I think, the type of honesty that a lot of my students struggle to reach without going through the deliberate process of evaluating pre-flop in a lot of detail. Pre-flop just feels like that type of thing that everyone should have under control. And most of us don't have it as figured out as we think. So highlighting right at the beginning here that there's specific areas of pre-flop that need some attention, that's a great place to start. The second paragraph here, curious to know more about blind versus blind pots and multi-way pots. These situations confuse me, and it's hard to pick up on patterns in the sims. This is great. This points to a theoretical concern, right? So we've evaluated skills, we've evaluated practice, we've evaluated theory, all sorts of different areas. So this is a space where you can write down anything that's on your mind as a result of going through that evaluation. It's always a good place to start, is just sort of like a journaling exercise. Just write down anything that's on your mind. This says I'm much more comfortable in heads up pots, especially in position. Not sure if there's good enough resources around to answer some of these more complex scenarios. So I left this kind of open-ended because I do think this is one of the harder parts of the course. Translating a whole bunch of evaluation metrics into an action plan is something that I would normally handle in my private coaching. And a lot of times it does take expert feedback to say, hey, you need to focus on these few things first and forget about all that other stuff that's kind of nagging at you. This is why I've broken up the evaluation into like fundamental categories and advanced categories to give you that initial sense of if there's any confusion in these fundamental areas, we start there. If there are advanced concepts that you feel ready to take on, you can push in that direction only once you've started to feel really, really good about your fundamentals. So that's going to lead us to the next part of the sheet here. This is basically the study template. And I use this with a lot of my private students, or some version of this, something very similar to this, where we've identified high and low priority, theory and practice. Really just kind of captures the theme of how I'm organizing this course as well. The idea here is to separate the types of work that you need to focus on, and in that way come up with a more clear strategy, a more clear schedule for studying, for training going forward. So we've got two high priority areas here. We've got high priority training and high priority study. The pre-flop concerns, the out of position play from the big blind, this is trainable, right? This is the type of concern that takes repetition and familiarity and variation in gameplay. So if there are fundamental areas of the game tree, like pre-flop decisions, like out of position facing c-bet, that you're feeling uncomfortable with, this is my number one recommendation for how to work on that, is just to play the spot over and over and over. Continue playing the spot and play it in an environment where you're getting feedback. Low priority training is things that don't necessarily fit in as fundamental, things that come after what you've highlighted in high priority. So cold four betting is a confusing area of pre-flop play, but much less common and much less fundamental than squeezing and blind versus blind. So very good organization here by the student, by the fake student. And decisions like this, how to organize, is something that I'm going to create space for in the Discord community, which I think is just going to be really valuable for, like, not everyone's going to want to share their study notes or share their evaluation. I understand that. But seeking feedback on how you've prioritized things is going to be really key. And that's something that I'm going to be focusing on a lot personally in the way that I interact in the community. Same for post-flop here. You've got, out of position play in general. We've highlighted the most common scenarios in high priority. Single raise pots, 3-bet pots on the flop. Perfect. High priority because it's very common. Post-flop low priority, delayed check raising, turn c-betting. These are difficult spots. These are complicated. But of course, they can only be studied once we have a pretty good grasp on what we're doing on the street prior. So again, I like the organization here. We want to start with the very basics, feel good about our strategy there, and then move to the more complicated situations. So that's training areas. That could be, depending on how much time you're investing, that could be a monthly commitment where you start with your high priority nodes, see how much you accomplish in a month, and then revisit this sheet after a month to see if you can do some reorganizing. That's how I do it personally. About once a month, I check in on my list, on my to-do list. And if anything can be shuffled, if something high priority can be marked complete, if something low priority can be moved up, that's about how often I check in on that. But depending on how much training you're doing, you can adjust that timeline. For study, this evaluation wrote down mixed strategy, simplification, and player type adjustments. That's great. And these are the types of study that I highlight in the later section, in the study section of this course, where depending on what scenario you're stuck with, I've suggested my favorite method of addressing that problem, right? So if you're trying to figure out how to adjust to different player types, you're probably node locking in a post-flop solver. You're looking to run experiments in simple post-flop, simple pre-flop, experiments in PO solver to figure out how would I change the way that I'm approaching my strategy depending on, if I force them to be really aggressive, if I force them to be really sticky, whatever it is. Simplifying mixed strategies is something that I'm going to go over throughout the game plan, because this is something that comes up a lot when game planning for Heads Up No Limit. But these are theoretical concepts that are reasonably high priority. These are both somewhat advanced for what it's worth, but reasonably high priority study situations. And at some point in this course, I've provided a method for doing that if you aren't comfortable doing it already. The low priority stuff here, blockers and unblockers, polarized preflop ranges, these are also advanced concepts that I'm either going to have a video or a seminar covering. We're still, at the time of filming this, we're still working out the details on that. But again, anything that I've included in the evaluation as a theoretical concept that's important or a theoretical concept that's fundamental, I've also done my best to recommend the method in which I would study that concept. So that's the whole plan here. And almost certainly this student has more things in their evaluation, right? I'm just showing the quick summary here, the template. But there is a skill to trimming down what you found from that evaluation and turning it into this. I think 1 page is a really good goal for making it look achievable, for making it feel achievable. And that 1 page can always be updated. Keep your detailed stuff in another document, keep your backlog somewhere else, and just have your 1 page to-do list in this format or in a variation of this format that you come to very, very frequently. And this is going to be your home base for study. I'm going to show you one more example of someone filling out this template. And this one has a bit of a different spin on it because the first evaluation, the first student was clearly focused on the strategic aspects of the evaluation. And that's not how everyone's going to come away from doing that evaluation. I think some of you are going to come away from that evaluation feeling that your approach to strategy, your approach to learning is pretty good. And there are other aspects that I've highlighted on the list that you're curious about or that you're concerned about. So that's what this example is meant to highlight. It says, after the evaluation, I believe that my approach has emphasized too much study. And this is something that I can personally relate to. So I was kind of writing it that way. They feel confident in theoretical knowledge and feels comfortable with solvers. So this is great. This means that the tools necessary to work on strategy and to work on theory are locked in. Those come natural. Maybe this is someone with a higher education background, with a computer programming background, right? Someone who feels pretty good using tools and maybe is even comfortable with game theory. Now, they say that the areas I'd like to focus on going forward are exploitative play and mental game. So that's great. And these are difficult but achievable skills to train. These are non-standard, I think, like in the sense that they're not often addressed as primary focus of study. Most training sites, most content will focus on strategy. And I do think that de-emphasizes the importance of these otherwise intangible seeming aspects of the game. And I do think that there's strategies we can implement, or at least there's intention that we can apply to the way that we study or the way that we train to help address these concerns. So this goes on to say, my results against unpredictable players tend to be worse than results against regulars, which might sound unusual, but I've seen this with enough students at this point that I'm quite sure it's a common problem, to actually perform worse against like wild, recreational, seemingly, live players, and winning against regulars, winning against good players. This is more common than you might think, unless you're one of those players, then you already know. It says, I'm often not willing to make exploitative river decisions, so I default to a GTO style of defending correctly and bluffing the right combos. And again, leading into questions, and I want to encourage you, when you're making your own notes, when you're writing your own study guide, don't stop simply at the point where you've highlighted a couple of things you're not good at. How can I build up my confidence in my ability to deviate? And then it goes on to point out the mental game issue. These situations are discouraging, and when I lose in soft lineups, I find it difficult to keep putting in volume. So these are important concerns to be honest about, because your win rate does not only come from your strategic understanding, your strategic execution, right? It also comes from how well do we show up every day? How confident are we when we play? How good is our river decision making? These things matter a lot. So I've broken down the study plan here in the same way. We've got high and low priority training. We've got high and low priority theory. What we've done, though, is we've moved the emphasis away from specific nodes in the game tree, specific spots, right? We're not looking at positional analysis. We're not looking at pre-flop charts. I've listed under high priority 3 different points here that are almost completely separate from working on your poker game, right? So to work on concerns with confidence, to work on concerns with putting in volume, I feel that I've gotten a lot of value in focusing on daily routine, focusing on mindfulness, right? Putting emphasis into things, and I'm not making specific recommendations here because that's not my area of expertise, but the things that work for you to balance out the rest of your life very often is going to have a positive influence, leveling out things like your comfort when you play, right? If there's stressors that are kind of sitting in the background while you're trying to make decisions, or if you're just facing decision fatigue in general because of other things, then coming up with a strategy to address that is going to be really important. And I do think that these fall under the category of training methods, because they're equally important to registering tournaments on time, to scheduling your series, right? There's tactical decisions that happen before you sit down. So that's where things like mindfulness and daily routine would come in as a recommended training method. The third one I wrote here, low stakes online challenge, might sound a little bizarre, but what I'm suggesting for this particular case is a way of addressing their unfamiliarity with playing against these like volatile, extreme player profiles. I think that if you live and breathe theory and practice mostly in a theoretically constrained environment, whether that's using a trainer, whether that's playing high stakes games against tough competition, whatever it is that has led them down this path, I think it's pretty common to just have limited exposure to those player types. So deliberately forcing yourself to play low stakes online will expose you to the player types that you're struggling with in those higher stakes games. So if you play live and you're a game starter, you show up at 10 a.m., you play with a lot of regs, it's very likely that there's only 1 or 2 volatile players who are going to sit in your game all day or maybe all week. The number of hands you get in against them, the number of showdowns you see against them is so limited. And your ability to improve against that player type is going to be constrained by that. So going out of your way to play against those types of players as often as possible is a training method. And very often, I think players will deal with this by just jumping into a small stakes game and taking it as seriously as they can. So, analyzing hands, analyzing tendencies, looking at showdowns, taking notes, with just as much focus as you would in a high stakes game, but doing it for 5 cent, 10 cent online, or doing it for play money online. This can be really valuable. And I think it's very often, I think players often underestimate how much effort it takes to be really, really skilled against a bad player, as strange as that sounds. So giving that the priority it deserves, I think, is a really effective training method for this case. Now, I wrote under low priority here some other ideas for what they could do to get out of their comfort zone a little bit. Post-flop training with different speeds to it, so intentionally slow playing or intentionally fast playing, are going to force them to play in the different environments, in the different sort of states of different mental states that come up depending on what's being thrown at them what's being thrown at them both at the table and off the table, right? So if they are under a lot of stress and the way that they play is influenced by that only when they're playing fast, but not when they're playing slow, then that's going to show up in their intentionally fast post-flop training. And I just mean like opening a solver and giving yourself a virtual time bank of 5 seconds or 3 seconds or something, right? Really pushing the boundaries of how quickly you're playing. And then evaluating the way that you played under those circumstances. And then doing the opposite as well, forcing yourself to take 20 full seconds before every decision. And using that time to develop thought process, using that time to go through options that you wouldn't have otherwise gone through. And I think that this would be a good way of addressing poor performance versus volatile players or recreational players, because taking extra time to consider all options is going to make you more creative. And it's going to have you choosing options that you wouldn't have otherwise come to if you were just kind of letting your automatic GTO style framework take over. Now for study, I've highlighted node locking. I think this is an obvious one. Anyone who's struggling to adjust to different player types, and I already kind of talked about it, the best theoretical way to work on this is to expose yourself to the results of node locked simulations. So you can't be good at adjusting unless you know the optimal solution against that profile. And this is going to be, there's a lot of good resources. There's a lot of training videos that highlight the methodology here. And I'll give it a little bit of attention as well during the game planning section of this course. The other thing that this evaluation highlighted was river decision making, a lack of confidence in river decision making. So the theory of hero calling and the theory of hero folding is something that I've highlighted here. And this is a little more experimental as a study method, but it's going to be very similar to node locking in technique. It's going to involve creating the right conditions where calling full range or folding full range or calling with a specific type of hand or folding a specific type of hand, it's going to be a bit of iterative experimentation to see what conditions need to be in place for that to be the right play. So this is all about challenging assumptions, right? This would be a deliberate practice of looking at solutions, seeing that call you made that one time was solver approved, and then not stopping there, forcing yourself to go further into that and challenge the idea that solver approved is good enough, and look to see, okay, how can I make this a bad call? What tweaks can I make to my opponent's range that are realistic, of course, not just trying to cherry pick the result, but what adjustments can I make to my opponent's range, and does that push it in the direction of being a fold? Same thing for the other side of it, right? Just depending on what issue it is you're trying to address. These, I think, are things that can be done independently. So I listed them as high priority, although I do think that some of this stuff would be pretty challenging for someone who's not comfortable with all the tools. I did, note that this particular student was comfortable with all the tools. But if you were in this type of situation and you weren't comfortable with the tools, it would probably help to reach out to the study group or to hire a coach for assistance with this type of work. Same with the low priority study here. Data analysis. Data analysis does not come natural to everyone. It's something I emphasize in this course. You can look at the database review video if you think that that's something you can handle on your own. I think that that's a great way, again, to break out of GTO framework is to find opportunities to do so profitably. And thinking about the game from the point of view of adjusting to population data instead of the framework of I have to play this way because it's correct is going to help someone who's stuck in this mindset. The last thing here is thought process outline. And this is something I'm hoping to cover under the topics of bluff catching or bluffing rivers. I think it's very common not to recognize what thought process we go through when we are in a river decision. And again, almost like a journaling exercise or just as a tracking exercise, to take note of what comes to mind and in what order when we're making river decisions can be really beneficial. And this is something that, again, it's a non-standard study method, but it's just kind of getting to know yourself and what your tendencies are. But in a more specific situation than like getting to know your river betting frequencies or getting to know your turn betting frequencies, you're trying to familiarize yourself with what it is that crosses your mind and what it is, perhaps more importantly, that doesn't cross your mind when you're making a river decision. And I've found with some of my students this to be really enlightening to adjust their mindset when it comes to making exploitative decisions, especially. So these are meant to just be some ideas to get you thinking about what it is you want to highlight, what it is you want to prioritize the first time you go through this study template. Again, if you've just done your evaluation for the first time, hopefully it won't be the last time that you go through this process. So you don't need to get everything correct the first time through. I think it's quite important, again, to keep this achievable, to keep it much shorter than you think it needs to be. One page is really, it's even a lot, given how long it's taken me to explain just like the to-do list for this one person. Even though they're only focusing on high priority first, this is a lot to work on, right? And there's going to be a lot of friction and it's going to take time to get into these things. So don't try and take on too much at once. Go through this process, perhaps quickly the first time, just writing down instinctively what feels most important. And again, don't worry about getting it perfect. And if you're willing, definitely share it with the community for feedback, because I think that that's going to help that optimization that you might be looking for. And again, you should expect to go through this more than once in your career. You should expect to move through this list, maybe feel like you're in a different place with your game in a few months or in a year, and do the evaluation all over again and form a new template all over again. And you're always going to have more time to work on the things that you kind of knock down the list into low priority or even, somewhere off the first page here.